inflation is going to be rampant. I mean, that's just the way this is going to end up. There's no other politically viable alternative. I don't see the significant cuts to government spending that would be necessary to avoid much higher inflation. I don't see the Fed pursuing the type of monetary policy that would really be necessary to force the government into, making those difficult choices. I think all the factors are going to come down on inflation. They're going to keep on spending money. They're not going to cut anything. Everybody's going to get paid their Social Security benefits and their Medicare benefits and their pensions. The problem is the money's not going to buy very much, because if you need $1,000 to buy a pack of chewing gum, I doubt your Social Security benefits are going to keep pace with that. Even though they do have these cost of living adjustments, they're not going to capture anywhere near the degree to which the cost of living is actually going up. And it doesn't have to get as bad as Zimbabwe, right? That's a worst case scenario, or Weimar Republic Germany. I mean, you have these examples of severe hyperinflation. But I think there's no question that we are going to suffer very high inflation. Whether it ends up being the type of inflation, where we're all trillionaires, because everybody in Zimbabwe, it's not they're all millionaires, they're all trillionaires, right? But what good is $1 trillion Zimbabwe dollars doesn't even buy you a pack of chewing gum for $1 trillion Zimbabwe dollars. Maybe you could get a stick, I'm not sure. So I don't know that it's going to be that bad, but it's going to be very bad. Certainly it's going to be on an order of magnitude far greater than what Americans experienced during the 1970s. In fact, I think 2021 was as bad, if not worse, than any year of the 1970s. We just didn't measure prices as accurately in 2021 or 2022 as we did back in 1978, 1979, those years where inflation was very high, or throughout the whole decade. So I think it's already been worse than the 70s, but it's going to get a lot worse. And I think the catalyst for inflation, kicking into a much higher gear is going to be a large drop in the value of the dollar versus other currencies. That hasn't happened yet. The US dollar index is still, trading around 102. I think once it cracks through 70, that was about the low in 2008, 2011 timeframe. That was a record low for the dollar. I think once we take that out, we're going to be just in free fall territory. And I don't expect the rest of the world to come to the rescue of the dollar the way it did at that period of time. The world really supported the dollar in its time of need and propped it up. But I think those nations that defended the dollar so vigorously in the past are no longer allies with the dollar. I think a lot of those countries now want out of the dollar. They don't want to try to go out of their way to defend the U.S. dollar's reserve status and to maintain that monetary order. I think a lot of countries are going to, take, I don't know if it's pride or be joyful in looking at the dollar's demise, and they're going to maybe feel vindicated or feel that America is getting what it deserves. So I think we're really setting ourselves up for a currency crisis as the dollar loses its status as this reserve currency. And that is going to be the impetus for significantly higher price increases in the United States as all this money that we have been exporting for decades, comes back looking to buy stuff. And of course, we don't make much stuff thanks to, this system. We've been running these record trade deficits. In fact, we had another horrible trade deficit that came out last week that should have tanked the dollar and would have, had it been released in the 1980s when people still cared about the trade deficits. But, right now they're not. But they are going to care once the dollar really starts to crack and these trade deficits are unfinanceable. And without the trade deficits, there's nothing to buy because all the stuff that we buy is being imported, but we're not paying for it. We're just printing money. But when the world doesn't want the money we print anymore, then we're not going to have any ability to get the stuff they produce. And so the supply of goods is going to crash just as the supply of dollars is going to explode. It's going to be worse than what happened with the COVID lockdowns. You're going to see a bigger supply and demand imbalance when the dollar crashes. than when we just had, COVID. Because during COVID, we could still, import. Even though other countries were still locking down, we still had access to a lot of imports. The dollar went up, and so we were able to continue to consume, even though we didn't produce. But that's going to change dramatically, I think, during this dollar collapse. This morning, the dollar's up, because somebody at the Bank of Japan, even though they've got 4% inflation officially, which is the highest in 40 years, they're not doing anything about it. In fact, they're bragging about it. They're saying this is great. We dodged a bullet of deflation, so we're happy that we have some inflation now, and so there's no reason to raise interest rates. They're still negative. We don't have to stop printing money and buying Japanese government bonds. They've got the 10-year JGB pegged at about 0.5%. It was pegged at 25 basis points for a while. That they couldn't defend that anymore. So now they're at 50, but you can't defend that either. If inflation is 4%, what idiot is going to loan money for 10 years at 0.5%? But the Japanese have, backed themselves into a corner where they can't fight inflation, so they might as well welcome it and pretend that it's a good thing. But the question is, when are the Japanese people going to revolt about having too much of a good thing? Because inflation is going to keep getting worse in Japan, just like it's getting worse in Europe and the United States. And the reason that inflation is a problem all around the world is because politicians and central bankers made the same mistake in Europe and Japan that they made here. I mean, that's why it's a global problem. It's not that it absolves these politicians. If you hear Biden talk, he'll say, well, there's inflation in Japan, there's inflation in Europe, so it's not my fault how we have inflation in America. Right? No, it is his fault, and it's the Fed's fault, because the politicians all over the world made the exact same mistakes, and now they're all suffering the same consequence.